My name is Emily, and I'm 84 years old today. I've lived through 8 decades in Austin, Texas, watching this city grow from a quiet town into something I barely recognize. I've buried friends, raised children, and survived things that would break most people. But there's one story I've never told completely, one truth I've carried like a weight in my chest for over 60 years. When I was 18 years old, I discovered I was pregnant. But this wasn't a love story or a happy accident. The father of my child was my own father, a man who had been violating me for years, ever since my mother died when I was 12 and left me alone with him. He was respected in our community, went to church every Sunday, worked as a mechanic downtown. Nobody would have believed that this pillar of Austin society was capable of such horrible things. I remember the day I realized I was carrying his child. I stood in our tiny bathroom, staring at my reflection, and felt like I was drowning. In 1959, an unmarried pregnant woman was already considered ruined. But pregnant by your own father? That was something people couldn't even speak about. I felt completely alone, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I had no money, no family, nowhere to run. He controlled everything, where I went, who I talked to, what I ate. I was a prisoner in my own home, and now I was carrying the evidence of his crimes. For months, I lived in terror, convinced I would die giving birth to this child, convinced no one would ever help someone like me. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a stranger's small act of kindness can change everything. This is the story of how I found the courage to fight back, how I brought justice to a man who thought he was untouchable, and how the baby I named Hope became exactly that, my hope for a better life. It started with a book. Such a simple thing. A worn copy of Jane Eyre that I checked out from the Austin Public Library on a rainy Thursday in March. I was 5 months pregnant then, trying to hide my growing belly under loose dresses, sneaking out when my father was at work just to breathe air that didn't smell like motor oil and fear. The librarian who helped me that day was a young man named Samuel. He couldn't have been much older than me, with kind eyes and a gentle voice that didn't expect anything from me. When he handed me that book, our fingers touched for just a second, and something passed between us. Not romantic, nothing like that, but a recognition. Like he could see the pain I was trying so hard to hide. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back. Always when my father was working. Always careful to return before he came home. Samuel never asked questions, just recommended books, and sometimes made quiet conversation about the weather or the latest news from downtown Austin. He was the first person in years who treated me like I was worth something, like I had a mind capable of understanding stories about strong women who fought against impossible odds. And then one day, he did something that would change everything. He slipped a piece of paper into my book, just a small note with an address, and the words "safe place for women who need help." That's when I realized Samuel knew. Somehow, this stranger had seen through all my careful pretending and recognized what I was going through. What I did with that piece of paper, the choice I made in that moment, set in motion a chain of events that would bring my father face to face with consequences he never thought he'd have to pay. The man who had controlled every aspect of my life was about to learn that even the most powerless person can find a way to fight back when they're given the right tools and the right people standing beside them. But getting there meant risking everything I had left to lose. If you can, please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. It helps us to keep sharing meaningful stories like this. I grew up on Maple Street, just a few blocks from what's now the heart of downtown Austin. Back then, in the early 1950s, it was still a small place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Our house was a tiny white frame building with a front porch that my mama loved to sit on in the evenings, shelling peas or mending clothes while she watched the neighbors walk by. My father, John, worked at Henderson's garage on East 6th Street. He had rough hands from years of fixing engines, and a reputation for being able to get any car running again, no matter how beat up it was. People respected him. They'd tip their hats when he walked down the street, ask his advice about their automobiles, invite him to church suppers and community events. To the outside world, we looked like any other working-class family trying to make ends meet in Texas. My mother Clara was the gentle one, the one who sang while she cooked breakfast and read me stories before bed. She had soft brown hair that she wore pinned back and a laugh that made everything seem okay, even when money was tight or when my father came home in one of his moods. She was the buffer between his anger and me, always stepping in to smooth things over when he got frustrated. When I was 12, Mama got sick. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, then turned into something the doctor couldn't fix. She died on a Tuesday morning in September, just as the leaves were starting to turn. I remember standing in our kitchen afterward, staring at the breakfast dishes she'd never wash again, feeling like the world had tilted sideways and would never be right again. That's when everything changed. Without Mama there to witness his behavior, without her gentle presence to keep his worst impulses in check, my father became someone else entirely. Or maybe he just stopped pretending to be decent. The first time he touched me inappropriately, I was so shocked I couldn't even process what was happening. I was 13 and still grieving my mother, still trying to figure out how to cook meals and keep house the way she had. He told me it was normal, that this was what fathers and daughters did when they loved each other. When I cried, he said Mama would be disappointed in me for making such a fuss. When I tried to pull away, he reminded me that I had nowhere else to go, no other family who would take me in. And when I threatened to tell someone at school, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Who's going to believe a little girl over a respected man like me?" By the time I was 18 and discovered I was pregnant, I'd been living in that house of horrors for 6 years. 6 years of being told I was worthless, that what he was doing was my fault, that I should be grateful he kept a roof over my head. The girl who used to sit on the front porch with her mama, dreaming about her future, was gone. In her place was someone who jumped at shadows and flinched when people spoke too loudly. But I was still alive, and that baby growing inside me. That was life too, innocent life that deserved better than the darkness I'd been living in. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though there was plenty of that. The worst part was how he made it seem routine, almost boring. He'd come to my room after dinner, usually on nights when he'd been drinking, and afterward he'd go back to reading his newspaper or listening to the radio like nothing had happened. Like I was just another chore he'd crossed off his list. I learned to leave my body during those times. I'd stare at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a horse's head, and imagine I was riding that horse far away from Maple Street, far away from Austin, far away from Texas entirely. Sometimes I'd picture myself at Zilker Park, where Mama used to take me to feed the ducks when I was little. I'd imagine walking along the creek until it carried me somewhere safe, somewhere he couldn't find me. But I always came back to my body eventually. I always had to face the reality of bruises on my arms that I'd cover with long sleeves, even in the Texas heat. I had to sit across from him at the breakfast table and watch him butter his toast while he planned out loud what repair jobs he'd tackle that day, as if we were just a normal father and daughter discussing normal things. I stopped going to school regularly when I was 16. He said I was needed at home. That education was wasted on girls anyway, since I'd just end up married and taking care of some man's house. The truancy officer came by once, but my father charmed him the same way he charmed everyone else. Told him I was helping take care of a sick relative, promised I'd be back in classes soon. The man left satisfied, and I never saw him again. By 18, I was completely isolated. I hadn't spoken to another person my age in months. The only time I left the house was to buy groceries or run errands for him, and even then he'd time me, expecting me back within the hour. I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming a ghost in my own life. The morning I realized I was pregnant, I was standing at our kitchen sink, washing the breakfast dishes. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the counter to keep from falling. I'd been feeling sick for weeks, telling myself it was just stress, or maybe something I ate. But standing there with my hands in the soapy water, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. My face was pale and thin, but there was something different about my body, a fullness I hadn't noticed before. I pressed my hands to my stomach and felt a terror so complete it nearly stopped my heart. This wasn't just about me anymore. There was a baby growing inside me, a baby that would carry my father's blood, a baby that would be born into this nightmare I couldn't escape. I sank to the bathroom floor and stayed there for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't tell my father. The thought of his reaction made my stomach turn. I couldn't go to a doctor without him finding out, since he controlled every penny we had. I couldn't even imagine walking into one of Austin's churches and asking for help. What would I say? How could I explain how this happened without destroying what little reputation I had left? For the first time since Mama died, I seriously thought about killing myself. Not because I wanted to die, but because I couldn't see any other way out. I was 18 years old, pregnant by my own father, with no money, no friends, no family to turn to. It felt like being buried alive, like the walls of that little house on Maple Street were closing in around me. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought of that innocent life inside me, or maybe it was some stubborn part of Mama's spirit that refused to give up. Whatever it was, I got up off that bathroom floor and decided I had to find another way. I didn't know what that would look like yet, but I knew I couldn't give up without trying. Living with that secret was like carrying a lead weight in my chest. Every day felt longer than the one before. I'd wake up, and for just a split second, I'd forget what my life had become. Then reality would crash over me again. The pregnancy, the fear, the complete hopelessness of my situation. My father started noticing changes in me, though he didn't understand what they meant yet. I was throwing up most mornings, barely eating, moving through the house like a sleepwalker. He'd get irritated when I couldn't finish cooking his dinner, or when I'd have to run to the bathroom in the middle of doing laundry. "What's wrong with you lately?" he'd snap. "You're acting strange." I managed to hide the pregnancy for about 3 months. Loose dresses helped, and I was naturally thin anyway. But I knew it was only a matter of time before he figured it out. The thought of that conversation, of his reaction, kept me awake most nights. Would he be angry? Would he blame me? Would he try to get rid of the baby somehow? None of the possibilities I imagined ended well. The few times I did venture out into Austin, I felt like everyone was staring at me. At Miller's Grocery on South First, where I bought our weekly supplies, the clerk would barely look at me when I counted out coins for bread and milk. At the post office, where I sometimes had to mail my father's business correspondence, the postmaster would eye me with what I was sure was suspicion. Did they know? Could they tell something was wrong just by looking at me? I tried eating lunch at Murphy's Diner once, just to be around other people for a few minutes. I sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee and a piece of pie I couldn't afford, and listened to the conversations happening around me. Normal people talking about normal things, the weather, their jobs, their plans for the weekend. I felt like I was watching them through glass, like I was some other species entirely. When the waitress asked if I was feeling all right, I left money on the table and hurried out without answering. The isolation was almost worse than the abuse itself. At least during those horrible nights in my bedroom, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. But during the long days when he was at work, I had nothing but my own thoughts for company. I'd sit on our front porch sometimes, watching cars drive past, wondering where all those people were going, whether any of them had problems like mine. I thought about running away constantly. I'd lie in bed making plans. I could hitchhike to Dallas or maybe San Antonio. Find work as a waitress or a shop girl somewhere nobody knew me. But I never had more than a few dollars at a time, and I knew how dangerous it would be for a pregnant woman to travel alone with no destination and no resources. Plus, he'd made it clear over the years that he'd come looking for me if I ever tried to leave. "You're all I have left of your mama," he'd say, which might have sounded sweet to an outsider, but felt like a prison sentence to me. The church was another dead end. We attended services at First Baptist most Sundays, where my father was well regarded as a hard-working widower doing his best to raise his daughter alone. Pastor Williams had even complimented him once on what a good, quiet girl I'd turned out to be. How could I walk into that man's office, and tell him what was really happening at home. Who would believe that John Morrison, the reliable mechanic who donated his time to fix the church van, was capable of such terrible things? By the time I was 5 months along, I was desperate enough to consider telling Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door and had always been kind to Mama. But every time I worked up the courage to knock on her door, I'd imagine her reaction. The shock, the disgust, the way she'd probably look at me like I was damaged goods. Worse, I knew she'd tell other people. In a town like Austin, news like that would spread faster than wildfire, and somehow I'd end up being blamed for seducing my own father or causing trouble for a good man. That's when I started going to the library. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere I could sit quietly for a few hours without anyone asking questions. The Austin Public Library was a small building then, nothing like the big modern one they have now. Just a few rooms filled with books and the smell of old paper. Most days, there was hardly anyone there except the librarians. The first few times I went, I just picked random books and pretended to read them while I tried to figure out what to do with my life. But gradually, I started actually reading stories about women who faced impossible situations and somehow found ways to survive. Jane Eyre, who stood up to the cruel adults in her life. Elizabeth Bennet, who refused to marry for convenience. These women existed only in books, but they gave me something I'd been missing for years. Examples of what courage looked like. And that's where I met Samuel. Samuel worked behind the circulation desk most afternoons. He was probably 22 or 23, with sandy brown hair that was always a little messy and glasses that he'd push up his nose when he was concentrating. He wasn't particularly handsome or impressive, just a quiet young man who seemed to genuinely care about books and the people who read them. The first time he spoke to me beyond the usual, "Can I help you find something?" I was sitting in the corner with a copy of Wuthering Heights, not really reading it but using it as a shield between me and the world. I must have looked terrible that day, pale and tired, probably holding the book upside down for all I knew. He walked over with a cup of water and set it down beside me. "You look like you could use this," he said simply. Not in a pushy way, not like he expected gratitude or conversation in return. Just a small kindness offered to someone who obviously needed it. I drank the water without looking at him, mumbled a thank you, and went back to staring at the pages. But something about that gesture stayed with me. It had been so long since anyone had noticed I was struggling, let alone tried to help. Over the next few weeks, Samuel and I developed a routine. I'd come in around 2 o'clock when my father was deep into his afternoon work and wouldn't expect me back for hours. Samuel would nod hello, sometimes recommend a book he thought I might enjoy, occasionally bring me tea or crackers if the library had any left over from some event. We didn't talk much at first, just small exchanges about authors or stories. But Samuel was observant. I could tell he was putting together pieces about my situation, even though I'd never said anything directly. He noticed that I always wore long sleeves, even when it was 90 degrees outside. He saw how I'd jump when the front door opened unexpectedly. He probably noticed that I was getting thinner everywhere except my midsection, which I tried desperately to hide under loose cardigans. One Thursday in late April, I was having trouble concentrating on anything. The baby had been moving a lot that morning, and I was terrified someone would notice. I kept shifting in my chair, pressing my hands to my stomach, trying to will the little flutters to stop. Samuel appeared at my table with a new book. "This one's about a woman who faces some difficult choices," he said, sliding it toward me. "I thought you might find it interesting." I looked down at the cover. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. But underneath the book, barely visible, was a small piece of paper. I glanced up at Samuel, but he'd already walked away, back to helping other patrons as if nothing had happened. When I was sure no one was watching, I unfolded the paper. In Samuel's careful handwriting were just a few words. "If you need help, there's a place. Ask me when you're ready." My hands started shaking. This stranger, this young man who barely knew me, had somehow figured out that I was in trouble and was offering assistance. I looked across the room at him, and for just a moment, our eyes met. He gave me the smallest nod, then went back to his work. I sat there for another hour, that piece of paper burning in my palm, trying to decide what to do. Part of me was terrified. What if Samuel was wrong about whatever help he was suggesting? What if getting involved with him somehow made my situation worse? But another part of me, a part that had been silent for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed, was whispering that this might be my only chance. When I finally got up to leave, I stopped at the circulation desk. Samuel looked up from the card catalog he was organizing. "The book you gave me today," I said quietly, so no one else could hear. "I think I'd like to know more about it." He studied my face for a moment, then wrote something on a scrap of paper. "Tomorrow at 3, he said, handing it to me. "Corner of Brazos and 4th Street. There's a coffee shop there, Mabel's. I'll be at a table in the back." I walked home that afternoon with my heart pounding harder than it had in months. For the first time since I'd discovered I was pregnant, I felt something other than despair. I felt possibility. That night, as my father sat in his chair reading the newspaper and I pretended to mend socks, I kept thinking about what Samuel had said in his note. "If you need help, there's a place." I didn't know what kind of place he meant, or whether I was brave enough to find out. But I knew I couldn't keep living the way I was living. Something had to change, and maybe, just maybe, this quiet librarian who'd shown me more kindness in a few weeks than I'd experienced in years was going to help me figure out how. I almost didn't go to Mabel's that next afternoon. I must have changed clothes 3 times, trying to find something that would hide my growing belly, but also make me look respectable enough to sit in a public place. I arrived 10 minutes late, hoping Samuel might have given up and left, giving me an excuse to turn around and go home. But he was there, sitting at a small table in the back corner with 2 cups of coffee already waiting. He stood up when he saw me, pulled out my chair like I was someone worth treating with courtesy. That simple gesture nearly undid me right there. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said once we were both seated. I wasn't sure either. My voice came out as barely a whisper. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee that tasted better than anything I'd had in months. Mabel's was busy enough that our conversation would be lost in the general chatter, but quiet enough that we could talk without shouting. Samuel waited, patient as always, for me to find my words. "You said there was a place that could help," I finally managed. "There is. But first, I need to understand what kind of help you need." He leaned forward slightly. "Emily, I've been watching you for weeks. You come to the library like it's a sanctuary. You jump every time someone speaks loudly. You're clearly pregnant but trying to hide it. And you look like someone who hasn't slept through the night in years." Hearing him lay it out like that was overwhelming. I started crying before I could stop myself, quiet tears that I tried to hide behind my coffee cup. Samuel pushed a clean handkerchief across the table without a word. "I can't tell you," I whispered. "You wouldn't believe me anyway. Try me." Something in his voice made me look up at him directly for the first time. His eyes were kind but serious, like he was prepared for whatever I might say. Like he'd heard difficult stories before. "My father," I started then stopped. The words felt impossible to speak out loud. "Since my mother died, he's been hurting me. And this baby," I pressed my hand to my stomach. "This baby is his." I expected Samuel to recoil, to make excuses to leave, to look at me with disgust or disbelief. Instead, he reached across the table and briefly covered my hand with his. "I believe you," he said simply. "And I'm sorry that happened to you." Those 4 words, "I believe you," hit me harder than anything he could have said. For 6 years, I'd been living with the certainty that if I ever told anyone the truth, they'd think I was lying or disturbed or somehow responsible for what my father had done. But Samuel's immediate acceptance of my story was like sunlight breaking through clouds I'd forgotten were there. "There's a woman named Margaret who runs a place for women in situations like yours," Samuel continued. "It's not official, the city doesn't know about it, and most people wouldn't approve if they did. But she helps women who have nowhere else to go." "What kind of place?" "A safe house. A place to stay while you figure out your next steps. Margaret was in a situation similar to yours once, years ago. She got out, and now she helps other women do the same. The idea of leaving my father's house, of having somewhere safe to go, was so foreign I could barely process it. He'd find me. He'd make me come back. Not if you don't want to go back. Margaret knows how to keep women safe from men who want to hurt them. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, sitting in the corner of Mabel's while the sun moved across the sky outside. Samuel told me about Margaret's house, located in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of Austin. He explained that women could stay there for weeks or months while they got back on their feet, found work, made plans for their futures. Some of them had children. Some of them were pregnant. None of them were judged for how they'd ended up needing help. The hardest part, Samuel said as we prepared to leave, is making the decision to go. Once you walk through Margaret's door, your old life is over. There's no going back to the way things were. I thought about that as I walked home, my mind spinning with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. Could I really leave? Could I really start over somewhere new, build a life for myself and my baby away from my father's control? That night at dinner, as my father complained about a difficult customer and planned his weekend fishing trip, I studied his face and tried to imagine never having to see it again. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. 3 days later, I met Samuel by the Colorado River, where we could talk without worrying about being overheard. I'd made my decision. I want to meet Margaret, I told him. Samuel smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. I was hoping you'd say that. Margaret's house looked ordinary from the outside. A 2-story white frame building on Rosewood Avenue with a small front garden and lace curtains in the windows. You'd never guess it was sheltering women running from the worst kinds of trouble. Samuel walked me to the front door on a Tuesday morning when my father was at work, then left me there with a gentle squeeze of my shoulder. Margaret answered the door herself. She was maybe 45, with prematurely gray hair and hands that looked like they'd seen hard work. But her eyes were warm, and when she looked at me, I didn't feel like she was cataloging my flaws or judging my situation. "You must be Emily," she said. "Samuel told me you might be coming by. Come in, dear." The inside of the house was nothing like what I'd expected. It was clean and comfortable, with mismatched furniture that somehow all worked together. I could hear women's voices coming from the kitchen, the sound of children playing in a back room. It felt lived in, like a real home instead of an institution. "There are 6 women staying here right now," Margaret explained as she led me to a small sitting room. 3 have children with them. Ages range from 16 to 52. All of them came here because they had nowhere else to go. She poured me tea from a pot that was already steeping and sat down across from me. "Samuel told me a little about your situation. Would you like to tell me the rest?" So I did. For the second time in a week, I found myself saying words I'd never spoken aloud before, describing things I'd tried so hard to forget. Margaret listened without interrupting, without gasping or making sympathetic noises that would have made me feel worse. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How far along are you?" she asked. "About 6 months. And your father doesn't know yet?" "No, but he will soon. I can't hide it much longer." Margaret nodded. "Then we need to move quickly. You can come stay here, Emily. Tonight, if necessary. But I want you to understand something. This isn't just about giving you a place to sleep until the baby comes. This is about deciding what kind of life you want to build for yourself and your child." She took me through the house, introducing me to the other women. There was Ruth, whose husband had broken her arm twice before she finally left him. Linda, who was 17 and pregnant by her stepfather. Mary, whose boyfriend had threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave. Each woman had her own story, but they all shared something I recognized. That particular wariness that comes from living in fear for too long. "The thing most people don't understand," Margaret said as we sat in her small office later, "is that leaving is just the beginning. The real work is figuring out how to make sure you never have to go back." She pulled out a folder filled with papers and started explaining options I'd never known existed. There were lawyers who worked with women in situations like mine, though finding one willing to take on a case involving incest would be challenging. There were social services that could help with medical care and finding work. There was even the possibility of pressing criminal charges, though Margaret was honest about how difficult that would be. In 1959, Emily, the courts aren't kind to women who accuse men of rape, especially when the man is the woman's father. You'll be questioned about everything: what you wore, whether you fought back, why you waited so long to report it. Some people will assume you're lying to get attention or money. The thought of sitting in a courtroom, telling a room full of strangers what my father had done to me, made my stomach turn. Then why would I even try? Because, Margaret said, if you don't, he'll probably do it again. Maybe not to you, but to someone else's daughter. And because your baby deserves to grow up in a world where men who do these things face consequences. That evening, I sat in Margaret's kitchen with the other women, eating a meal I hadn't had to cook, and listening to conversations about normal things: jobs, books, plans for the future. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something instead of completely alone. Linda, the 17-year-old, was helping with the dishes when she said something that stuck with me. My stepfather always told me I was worthless, that nobody would ever believe me over him. But Margaret says that was just another lie he told to keep me quiet. Later that night, lying in a clean bed in a room I shared with Ruth, I thought about what Linda had said. My father had told me the same thing, that nobody would believe me, that I'd be blamed if anyone found out. What if that was just another way of controlling me? I put my hand on my belly and felt the baby moving around. This little person was going to be born in a few months, and they were going to need someone to protect them. I'd failed to protect myself for 6 years, but maybe I could learn how to be stronger. Maybe I could make sure that what happened to me never happened to anyone else. The next morning, I told Margaret I wanted to talk to a lawyer. It won't be easy, she warned me, and there's no guarantee we'll win. I know, but I can't live with myself if I don't try. This baby is going to ask me someday what kind of world I brought them into. I want to be able to say I did everything I could to make it better. Margaret smiled and picked up the telephone. Then let's get started. The lawyer Margaret found for me was a woman named Anna Rodriguez. She was one of only 3 female attorneys practicing in Austin at the time, and the only one willing to take on a case like mine. We met in her small office above a drugstore on Congress Avenue, where she explained exactly what we were up against. The district attorney is going to want physical evidence, Anna said, reviewing the notes she'd taken during our first meeting. Medical records, witnesses, documentation of the abuse. Do you have any of that? I shook my head. He was always careful, and I never told anyone until now. What about the pregnancy? We can use that as evidence. But how do we prove it's his? He'll deny it, and people will believe him over me. Anna leaned back in her chair and studied me. Emily, I'm going to be completely honest with you. This is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. The police will question your story. The prosecutor might refuse to file charges. And if we do make it to trial, your father's attorney will try to destroy your credibility in front of a jury. So you think I shouldn't do it? I think you should do it because it's the right thing to do. But I want you to be prepared for how difficult it's going to be. The first step was filing a police report. Margaret and Samuel both offered to come with me, but I felt like I needed to do it alone. The Austin Police Department was housed in a brick building downtown that always intimidated me when I walked past it. Walking through those doors felt like crossing into enemy territory. The officer at the front desk was a middle-aged man who looked bored until I told him why I was there. Then his expression shifted to something between skepticism and distaste. You want to file charges against your father for rape? He repeated, loud enough that other people in the waiting area could hear. Yes, sir. He led me to a small room where Detective Morrison, no relation, despite sharing my father's last name, asked me to tell my story. I'd practiced what I would say, but sitting across from this stern-faced man in uniform, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How long has this been going on? He asked, taking notes on a yellow pad. Since I was 13, after my mother died. And you never reported it before now? No, sir. I was scared. Scared of what? Scared that no one would believe me. Scared of what he'd do if he found out I told. Detective Morrison looked up from his notes. Miss Morrison, Your father is John Morrison, correct? The mechanic who works at Henderson's garage. Yes, sir. I know John. He's a good man, been through a lot since his wife died. Are you sure you're remembering these incidents correctly? Sometimes grief can make people confused about what really happened. I felt my face get hot. I'm not confused. I'm pregnant with his child. You're pregnant, yes. But how do we know your father is responsible? Young women sometimes get into trouble and then look for someone to blame. I left the police station that day feeling smaller than I had when I walked in. Detective Morrison said he'd investigate my allegations, but his tone suggested he was just going through the motions. I could tell he'd already decided I was either lying or delusional. 2 days later, my father came home from work earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and trying to figure out how to tell him I wouldn't be coming home that night, that I was moving to Margaret's house permanently. Emily, he said, his voice calm but with an edge I recognized. I had an interesting conversation today with Detective Morrison. My blood went cold. I kept my back to him, focusing on stirring the pot of beans on the stove. He says you've been telling stories about me. Nasty stories. His footsteps moved closer. I told him you've been acting strange lately, probably because of your condition. I explained that pregnant women sometimes get confused, start imagining things that never happened. I turned to face him then and saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, not just anger, but real fear. He was afraid that someone might believe me. They're not stories, I said quietly. You know what you did to me. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, squeezing hard enough to leave marks. Listen to me very carefully. Detective Morrison believes you're a troubled young woman who got herself pregnant and is now trying to blame her poor father. That's the story everyone in this town is going to hear if you keep talking. Is that what you want? Let go of me. Answer me, Emily. Is that what you want? To be known as the crazy girl who tried to destroy her father's reputation with lies. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. The only lies here are the ones you've been telling for 6 years. About what kind of man you are. About what kind of father you are. He released my wrist and stepped back, maybe surprised by the steel in my voice. You can't prove anything. Maybe not. But I'm not going to stop trying. That night, I packed my few belongings into a paper bag and walked to Margaret's house. When I told her what had happened at the police station, she wasn't surprised. The first attempt usually doesn't work, she said. Men like your father are good at manipulating people, especially other men. But that doesn't mean we give up. Detective Morrison thinks I'm lying. Detective Morrison doesn't matter. There are other ways to get justice, Emily. Other people who might listen. We just have to be smarter about how we approach this. Sitting in Margaret's kitchen that night, surrounded by women who had their own battles with men who thought they were untouchable, I realized something important. The system might not be on my side, but I wasn't fighting alone anymore. And sometimes that makes all the difference. Anna wasn't willing to give up as easily as Detective Morrison had hoped. 3 days after my disastrous visit to the police station, she called Margaret's house with a different approach. We need to build a case they can't ignore, she said when I met her at her office. That means documenting everything, every injury, every threat, every piece of evidence that supports your story. But I don't have evidence. I never took pictures or kept records. Then we'll create a record starting now. Did your father ever hurt you badly enough that you needed medical attention? I thought about it. There was a time when I was 15. He pushed me down the stairs, and I think I broke a rib. But I never went to a doctor. What about other injuries? Bruises, cuts, anything that someone else might have seen? Mrs. Henderson next door saw me with a black eye once. I told her I fell off my bicycle. Anna made notes. We'll talk to Mrs. Henderson. What about at school before you stopped going regularly? Did any teachers notice anything? It was slow work, reconstructing years of abuse that I'd tried so hard to forget. But Anna was patient, helping me remember details I'd buried. The time Mr. Phillips, my English teacher, asked why I was limping. The time the school nurse noticed fingerprint bruises on my arms. The pharmacist who'd given me aspirin when I came in with a swollen jaw, claiming I'd walked into a door. These people may not have realized what they were seeing at the time, Anna explained, but their testimony could help establish a pattern of abuse. While Anna worked on building our legal case, Margaret helped me work on building my strength. Living at the shelter was like learning to be human again. I had to remember what it felt like to eat meals without being afraid someone would criticize my cooking. I had to get used to sleeping through the night without listening for footsteps in the hallway. The other women became like sisters to me. Ruth taught me how to do my hair in a style that made me look older, more confident. Linda helped me practice what I would say if we made it to trial, playing the role of hostile attorney so I could get used to defending my story. Mary, who had 2 small children, showed me how to change diapers and mix baby formula, practical skills I'd never learned. As my pregnancy progressed and my belly became impossible to hide, Margaret took me to see Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the few female physicians in Austin. Dr. Chun was small and serious, with gentle hands and a no-nonsense approach to medicine. "This baby is healthy," she told me after my examination. "But I need to ask you some difficult questions about the father." When I explained the situation, Dr. Chun didn't flinch or look uncomfortable. She simply made notes in my file and explained that she would document everything carefully, in case her records were needed for legal proceedings. "Have you thought about what you want to do after the baby is born?" she asked. "I want to keep her. I want to raise her somewhere safe." "Her?" I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "I don't know for sure, but I keep thinking it's a girl. I've been calling her Hope." Dr. Chin smiled back. "Hope is a beautiful name." That night, lying in my bed at Margaret's house with my hands on my belly, I talked to Hope for the first time out loud instead of just in my thoughts. "I know your story is going to start in a complicated way," I whispered. "And I know people might say cruel things about how you came to be here. But I want you to know that you were never the problem. You were never something shameful. You're the reason I finally found the courage to fight back." Hope kicked in response, as if she understood. Samuel visited regularly, bringing books from the library and news from downtown Austin. He'd become something like a brother to me, someone I could count on without worrying about his motives. One evening in November, as we sat on Margaret's front porch watching the sun set, he asked me something I'd been wondering about myself. "Are you scared about testifying?" "Terrified," I admitted. "What if the jury doesn't believe me? What if they think I'm lying or crazy, like Detective Morrison did? Then at least you'll know you tried. Emily, 6 months ago you were completely alone, convinced you had no choices. Look at you now." He was right. I was still scared, still uncertain about the future, but I wasn't the broken girl who used to hide in the library anymore. I had allies now, people who believed in me and supported me. I had legal representation and medical care, and a safe place to live. Most importantly, I had hope, both the baby I was carrying and the feeling itself. A week before my due date, Anna came to Margaret's house with news. "The district attorney has agreed to file charges," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "Rape in the first degree and incest. If we win, your father could go to prison for 20 years. My legs went weak, and I had to sit down. They actually believed me? The evidence we gathered was too strong to ignore. Mrs. Henderson's testimony about your injuries, your school records showing increasing absences and declining grades after your mother's death, Dr. Chen's medical documentation, it all supports your story. When is the trial? Probably not until after Hope is born and you've recovered. Are you ready for this, Emily?" I thought about everything I'd been through to get to this point. The months of fear and silence, the moment of courage when I first told Samuel the truth, the slow process of building a new life at Margaret's house. I thought about Hope, who would be born into a world where her mother had fought back against the man who hurt them both. "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time in my life, I really meant it. The morning of the trial, I woke up before dawn with my hands shaking so badly I couldn't button my dress. Hope was due any day now, and my belly was so round I had to turn sideways to fit through doorways. Margaret helped me get ready, braiding my hair back in a style that made me look older, more serious. The courthouse was this imposing brick building on Guadalupe Street that I'd walked past 1,000 times without ever imagining I'd be inside it. Anna met us at the steps, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with our evidence, medical records, statements from the women at Margaret's house, even a sworn affidavit from Mrs. Henderson about the injuries she'd witnessed over the years. When we walked into that courtroom, I felt every eye turn toward me. Word had gotten around Austin, and people had opinions. Some folks looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. My father sat at the defendant's table in his best Sunday suit, looking like the upstanding citizen everyone thought he was. When it came time for me to testify, my legs barely carried me to the witness stand. The courtroom was packed, seemed like half of Austin had shown up. Samuel sat in the front row where I could see him, and every time I felt like I couldn't go on, I'd look at his encouraging face. Anna walked me through my story, starting with Mama's death, and the first time my father came to my room. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, saying those words out loud in front of all those people. But with each question, I felt a little stronger. Then came the cross-examination. Mr. Patterson, my father's lawyer, stood up like a predator circling wounded prey. "Miss Morrison," he began, "isn't it true that you've been troubled since your mother's death? Your teachers described you as withdrawn and possibly disturbed." "I was withdrawn because I was being hurt at home," I replied. "I couldn't concentrate on schoolwork because I was afraid of what was waiting for me." He pressed harder. "This pregnancy, isn't it more likely that you got yourself into trouble with some boy and are now blaming your poor father?" That's when Anna presented the medical evidence Dr. Chen had documented. The timing of the pregnancy, the physical evidence of repeated trauma, the careful notes about injuries consistent with ongoing abuse. We also heard from Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor. She walked slowly to the witness stand, looked directly at my father, and said in her clear, steady voice, "I saw that child with more bruises than any young person should have. And I saw the fear in her eyes whenever her father came home. When my father testified, he played his part perfectly. The grieving widower, the hard-working man trying to raise his daughter alone. He denied everything with tears in his eyes. 'I love Emily,' he said to the jury. 'She's all I have left of her mother.' The trial lasted 3 days. By the end, I was exhausted and terrified it had all been for nothing. After closing arguments, the jury went out to deliberate. I spent those hours in a small room with Samuel, Margaret, and Anna, trying not to think about what would happen if they didn't believe me. Finally, we heard the knock. The jury had reached a verdict. Walking back into that courtroom was like walking to my own judgment. The foreman stood up, a piece of paper trembling in his hands. Judge Harrison asked the question that would determine the rest of my life. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant, John Morrison, on the charge of rape in the first degree?" The pause before the answer felt like it lasted a year. The jury was out for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. I sat in that hallway outside the courtroom, my hands pressed against my belly, where hope was kicking like she knew something important was happening. Margaret held my other hand while Samuel paced back and forth, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. When they called us back in, my legs barely carried me. The foreman stood up, this older man with kind eyes who'd been looking at me with something like sympathy throughout the trial. Judge Harrison asked the question that would determine everything. "Guilty." That one word hit me like lightning. My father's face went white, then red, then something I'd never seen before, defeated. For the first time in my life, John Morrison looked small. The judge sentenced him to 15 years. 15 years where he couldn't hurt me, couldn't hurt anyone else's daughter. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me once. Not with anger, not with that familiar thread in his eyes. He looked empty. I started crying then, but they weren't the tears I'd cried for 6 years. These were different. Margaret wrapped her arms around me, and I felt something I'd forgotten existed: safety. Real safety. "It's over, Emily," she whispered. "You did it." But even as I stood there, watching my father disappear through those courthouse doors, I knew it wasn't really over. It was just beginning. For the first time in my life, I could imagine a future. And that future had a name: Hope. Hope arrived 3 weeks later, on a cold February morning in 1960. The pain of labor was nothing compared to what I'd already survived, and when Dr. Chin placed that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, I understood why people say having a child changes everything. She had my mother's nose and the most determined little cry you ever heard. I'd been so afraid during the pregnancy that I might look at her and see him. But when I looked into Hope's face, all I saw was possibility. All I saw was mine. Margaret let us stay at the shelter for 6 more months while I figured out what came next. Samuel found me work with a seamstress downtown named Mrs. Patterson, who didn't ask questions about my past. She taught me to embroider and alter clothes, and I discovered I had steady hands for detailed work. Funny how the same hands that used to shake with fear could create something beautiful. Samuel never married, though he had plenty of chances. He said he preferred books to romance, but I think he just liked being Uncle Samuel to Hope. He'd come by every Sunday with picture books and later, when she got older, with novels that challenged her mind. By the time Hope was 10, she was reading at high school level. The hardest conversation of my life happened when Hope turned 16. She'd been asking questions for years about her father, and I'd managed to deflect them with stories about a young man who'd gone off to war. But she was too smart for those lies, and I realized she deserved the truth. We were sitting on the front porch of the little house I'd managed to buy on the east side of Austin. Hope was working on her homework, and something about the peaceful evening made me finally find the courage. "Hope, honey, I need to tell you something about where you came from." When I finished the whole story, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at me with those serious eyes and said, "Mama, I always wondered why you were the strongest person I knew. Now I understand." She never made me feel ashamed of how she was conceived. Instead, she made me feel proud of how we'd both survived it. Now, at 84, I watch my great-granddaughter Emma play in the same backyard where Hope took her first steps. Emma's got that same determined cry Hope had as a baby, and when she falls down, she gets right back up. That's what we do in this family, we get back up. Hope became a social worker, which didn't surprise me one bit. She spent her career helping families navigate the system that had almost failed us. She married a good man named David who knew our whole story before he proposed and loved us both anyway. They gave me 3 grandchildren who call me Mama and think I'm invincible. About 10 years ago, I started going back to Margaret's old shelter. It's called The Haven now, run by a young woman who reminds me of myself at 18. Every Tuesday morning, I sit in a circle with women who are living through their own versions of hell. I don't give them advice or tell them what to do. I just listen, the way Samuel listened to me all those years ago. Sometimes they ask how I survived, how I found the strength to fight back. I tell them about the day I walked into that library, scared and pregnant and sure I was alone in the world. I tell them about Samuel's kindness, Margaret's fierce protection, and Anna's unwavering belief in justice. I tell them that courage isn't something you're born with, it's something you choose, one small decision at a time. Last month, a 19-year-old girl named Maria sat in that circle, shaking as she told her story. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "I don't think I'm brave enough to leave." I reached across and took her hand. "Maria, you walked through that door today. You told your truth to a room full of strangers. You're already braver than you know." She's living at the Haven now, learning to embroider like I did, saving money for nursing school. Yesterday she brought me a card that said, "Thank you for showing me what's possible." That's the thing about surviving. It's not just about saving yourself. It's about becoming the person you needed when you were drowning. Samuel was that person for me. Margaret was that person. Dr. Chun, Anna, even Mrs. Henderson who finally spoke up. They all showed me that strangers can become family when you need them most. I'm 84 now and my body is tired, but my voice is stronger than it's ever been. Because every Tuesday morning, I get to look into the eyes of women who think their stories are too shameful to tell, and I get to say the words Samuel said to me in that library so long ago. You don't have to go through this alone. That's legacy. Not the trial, not the justice, though those mattered. Legacy is knowing that somewhere in Austin tonight, there's a woman who's a little less afraid because she heard my story. Legacy is Hope, who's never known a world where her voice doesn't matter. Legacy is Emma, playing fearlessly in this backyard, growing up knowing she comes from a long line of women who refused to stay broken. I was 18 when I thought my story was ending. Turns out it was just beginning. I'm so grateful you've listened to my story this far. It's not always easy revisiting these memories, but knowing that sharing them might help someone else find their way makes it completely worthwhile. I truly hope that what I've shared today isn't just a sad tale, but also a source of motivation. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult life becomes, there's always light at the end of the road. Always remember that strength lies within you, and hope is a flame that should never be put out. To help us keep spreading these meaningful stories, please support the Grandparents Archives channel by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with your loved ones. I want to sincerely thank the founder of Grandparents Archives for giving me this opportunity to share my experience. Stay tuned for more touching stories on Grandparents Archives, and thank you all. With love, Grandma Emily.